This is a special episode of the Drum Show podcast. This is taken from a video on my main YouTube channel that has gone to almost 1 million views. It's a little bit of a different spin, and this is one of my favorite projects I've ever done. Here's the premise. You take the same song, you take 3 studio drumming legends, and you send them that song. No one hears each other's take, and then we see what each one does and what they do differently. Then I interview them. So on my main channel, we just posted basically their playthroughs, not even full playthroughs of them. On this episode, you're gonna get to see the full playthrough of each studio drumming legend's take and an interview with them. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. What were your, when you heard it and understood what the project was, what was your thought process when going through and trying to come up with the different parts for that and what it needed?
Well, I listened to it and thought this could go a number of different directions because it's kind of a fusion-y piece with some funk R&B kind of intermingled. And I love choppy finesse playing. I probably used to be better at it than I am now.
Right.
I'm staring 50 in the face, but I thought, well, I'm going to kind of try and blend the two. Generally, my first instinct is to find a pocket and a groove on something. And maybe that's just from so many years of being a session player where, in general, that's the call. But I wanted to, as I think I mentioned the last time we talked, I'm really trying to live by the rule and preach the rule of play the song, not the drums. So for me, I thought instead of making this a really flashy performance piece, I would like to play this like a groove drummer and then throw a couple of flourishes in different places. So that was my initial thought on it. And I wanted, I think I used kind of a fat snare because I didn't want it to turn into a really heavy, choppy, when I play really high pitched snares, I start getting tempted to get into all this kind of stuff. And I just didn't want to go there with it. Not because it was wrong. That was just a choice that I made sort of on a lark.
It's really interesting as a, I am a self-proclaimed drum nerd, and as a drum nerd that loves just looking at things and dissecting them and understanding parts and players, it was really fun to go through and see what everyone did, the different parts that they played, why they played them, their different treatments of the hi-hat, their different treatments. You and Dan fell on the same side of how you treated the song in just exactly as you explained it. Whereas Steve and I went a little bit to the other side. So his snare treatment was much more like a James Brown, like I Got the Feeling, where he delayed that to the upbeat. And I had a similar take on that. And what I noticed about yours was immediately in that first section, it really reminded me the hi-hat treatment you had where they were almost all even, and I wouldn't say accented, but they were pushing. In other words, they were a presence there. It reminded me like of a Parliament Flashlight or Rick James Super Freak or what's another one that Get Down on It by Kool and the Gang.
Mhm.
That heavy groove based where the hi-hat is really helping to drive that, point home.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I remember also thinking the A section, which I chose to play halftime on the ride cymbal, that probably could have worked staying full time as well. But for some reason, it felt like it needed the scene change to me. Like the whole thing wanted to open up a little bit. Um, and especially since it came back to that B section again, or sort of a semblance of it toward the end of the piece. So again, always, I'm just trying to figure out what does the song want. And
yeah.
what's fascinating, I'm sure, and I haven't, I might have heard a little bit of Steve Brewster's, but I really haven't heard much of the other approaches. And it's just fascinating to hear how different guys with amazing gifts with this instrument all approach it differently, because everybody's um, trying for the same thing, which is what does the song require of me here? And
Yeah.
everybody hears it a little bit different.
Well, and it's funny too because I didn't want to listen to anybody's take before I
Did yours?
did mine.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had heard I was in Mississippi and you had emailed me yours, and I listened to it on my phone and I couldn't really hear what was going on, and so then I sent it on to Tim, and then I told him I said I'm not listening to anybody's stuff, by the way, if you're wanting me to cut one of these because I don't want to unintentionally play a part that
Right,
someone
right.
played, and. There were two, Dan and Steve came into the song at the exact same time. You and I actually chose to come into the song and give it the space up front. It was really interesting some of the choices that were made and how similar they were to some of the other players. I also liked in that first section where when it repeated through, where you opened up those hi-hats a little bit. I thought that really added a little bit of extra energy in there to help it, I guess, build towards that halftime section.
Yeah, just a little tiny bit more to separate the sections, since it was a similar, that bass line is kind of what's driving that opening section. But for me, it just felt kind of nasty. And so that's what I wanted to lean into, was this is supposed to be kind of a funk piece. And that's
Yeah,
what I liked about it.
after that first halftime section, it's almost a breakdown bridge section.
Mhm.
What were you thinking going into that?
Well, my first thought was maybe I should really, really map this out and play this section totally different from the first section and make it more of a fusion thing where I'm playing around the beat. But the more I listened to it, well, I couldn't decide what to do with it. I had a bunch of ideas and all of them seemed about right to me. So I went with, again, letting the bass part and the guitar stuff be the star while I just kind of hold the fort down.
What
Um,
What's funny about that section is everybody made that choice for that section.
oh, is that
Um,
right?
they made the choice in some way to let everything else do the heavy lifting as far as the earrings and the lipstick
Right.
and all the other things that make it interesting in that section.
Mhm.
Everybody in their own way chose to just drive it. So Steve did a reverse boom chick, which had come into my mind as an option. I thought, well, that's one option that I could do to just drive this straight. I did a very much four on the floor, open hi-hat, accenting some on the upbeats that I felt just drove through it a little bit better and let everything else just,
Well,
almost.
I actually wish I'd had that idea. It would have separated. That's actually a great idea, because it would have differentiated a little bit more from my first approach to that section. Um, and that's a fantastic idea. I'm really anxious to hear what everybody did with this. Uh,
Well, and we've, because I heard everybody's after I heard mine, and then I wanted to email Tim and say, "Hey, send that. Just forget that. I wanted to do something. I was going to do something else on
yeah,
this other part. Don't worry about that."
yeah, that's the problem with this, is we're all going to kind of feed off of each other.
Yeah. So Tim and I this morning we were sitting there, and I said, "I don't think anybody." I said, "I wish I wouldn't have heard everything until it was just released, because now I'm like, well, I mean, I got time.
Yeah,
I
just
can just
redo it.
plug. Let me just give me another take, and which kind of defeats the purpose. But
Yeah.
I really think it speaks to. And another thing is everyone interpreted that halftime section as halftime, but
Hmm.
Dan did a really interesting treatment of it with the kick drum in particular. That get still, it was such a different treatment that I wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was one of those things that made me want to go, well, let me just go back in the cave and think for a while, and you can let me do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll do
Yeah.
it again.
So it's you and me and Dan and Steve?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's
This is a bunch of formidable drummers who are all going to have really interesting ideas about this stuff. And like I said, I'm kind of anxious to hear what everybody did so I can maybe learn something.
yeah. It was fun to go through it. And then I had another note here. What was it? The outro section. So, what was your thought process through that? Steve and Dan actually chose to give everyone obviously put their little stamp on the fill in that section because it's kind of begging for it. Steve and Dan did a little bit more of an open type of a fill, leaving some space in there. Um, Whereas myself and then you as well did a very cohesive thought, kind of pushed together, if it will, with more notes in that section. What were you thinking through as you were?
You're talking about kind of the very ending where there's a whole bunch of open space.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just pin up energy. I'm thinking I've restrained myself for this whole song, and so now I'm gonna just now I'm gonna take over because somebody left a hole for me to plug. Um, I mean, I don't know. It just seemed appropriate, because there was the one part of the song where there wasn't anything else going on, and I think as drummers we're sort of trained from a young age to, especially with hits like that, if you've listened to enough fusion music, generally speaking, a drummer's going to set those kind of things up.
Yep.
And so it was kind of a default for me. Whether it was the right thing to do remains to be seen. You can write it on my epitaph. Uh, but it just felt like, okay, here's one spot where I can actually fill it up just a little bit. And so,
Yeah. No, and that's interesting you bring that up because several of the sections reminded me of, college big band days
mhm.
where, they turn to you and hey, we need you to kick some things there. You need to figure out which hits you're going to hit there and figure out some kicks you can do for that, or,
Yeah.
drop the bomb on 4 there before you do that. It reminded me of that kind of pushing and prodding the band along.
Hmm.
My old drum teacher would always tell me it was he always imagined that the horns were going to forget their part and he needed to kick them in the pants. That was kind of when he's going through a chart. Oh, I need to kick them there, to remind
Yeah.
them that they got something to do.
Yeah.
It's interesting though. Everybody approached it intuitively, I think, knowing, well, we need to do something here.
It's
So
the end.
yeah,
It's the end of the song. You feel like you want to make a little bit of a statement to make sure everyone knows, okay, the song's over, right? Yes, it's over. The drummer just told us it's over. And there's no reprise, there's no fake ending. We're done here. So,
right. So I got 2 more questions for you.
okay.
The first one is, knowing the song wasn't going to have vocals, did that affect any of your thought process?
Well, um, probably not consciously, but in any situation, um, I mean, the short answer is yes, even if it's subconscious, because anytime somebody sends me something to play on, or if I'm in the recording studio with players uh, and working on something together, the song has to win. So whatever's going on in the song, whether it's instrumental or vocal, my job as a drummer is to lay the foundation and to kind of help paint the pieces of the mosaic that is the song. So in this case, listening down to it, it was clear there's no vocal here. So I'm playing to something that's essentially an instrumental. Again, it wasn't a conscious decision to play differently. It was just, what is this song? What am I listening to? And how do I fit in here as a drummer? I
Yeah.
don't know if that answers your question,
No, it does.
but it's going to have
Um,
to do because that's all I got.
that's all I got in me. Um, the other question is, because we have a lot of the students are they're just hobbyists and they wanted to learn the drums just to play more music, to be able to play music in the first place. They
Yeah.
don't have 20 hours a week for the drums. They maybe have 3 or 4 hours a week for the drums, but they want to get better at playing songs. Some of them are weekend warrior types where they've got a group, they go out and play. We've got all different types. So what is 2 or 3 things that you would pieces of advice, I guess, that you would give to them to become better at playing music?
Um, well, as I mentioned before, and I'll keep saying this, I'm drilling this into everybody: play the song, not the drums. That is critical. Music kind of doesn't matter if it doesn't reach the listener. And the way for us to do that is to be musicians first and to serve and honor the song. No matter how good or bad the song may be, just play the song. If that's kind of what you're called on to do. And one of the best ways to learn to do that is to have a really good musical vocabulary and spend a lot of time listening to lots of different genres of music, and digesting it. I'll force myself sometimes to listen to stuff I'm not even particularly fond of, because you're going to learn something from about any piece of music you listen to. Even as a drummer, listening, for instance, to classical music, which I love, but you're obviously not learning anything about the specific skill of striking a drum, playing the drum, but you learn a whole bunch about music. Listening to things like Wagner and Debussy, and even great movie scores, things like that. There's just something about the way that inside you that informs the way you approach music when you sit down behind a drum kit. So I find all of this stuff very interesting and fascinating. I think the bigger vocab you build, you've got a little tool chest over here, and each time somebody hands you a song, you just kind of reach over, open this drawer, pull out the thing that you got from listening to all this stuff over here. Just pull that out, put it down, play it, put it back in. You know it's right there the next time it becomes appropriate to reach for that tool. So, again, the only way to get those tools is just to keep listening to stuff that's musically intuitive, and again, get outside the scope of your pet genres, if that
Right.
makes sense. Listen to stuff that you might not always be inclined to listen to.
Right. Awesome. Well, man, before we kind of get out of here, I just want to say thank you for, the work you do and for taking the time to do this and, talk to the students and, help inform the generation. I know as someone that came up, loving to read about you and what you do, and Steve what he does, and Dan and what he does, you guys have been a big influence on my playing. So it's really fun for me to get to, share that with other students and things too. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, we're honored that you're doing what you're doing and that you've asked us to participate. That's really cool, and I'm thrilled to be here. And you're a good friend, so thanks, Stephen.
You bet, man. So yeah, so we can just kind of riff about what your thought process was, and it doesn't have to be, this doesn't have to be an hour-long call. It can just be you kind of just let me in on the creative process of what you were thinking when
Yeah.
you heard, why you made certain decisions,
Well,
and I got a
man,
couple things I'll bring out.
I'll start by saying this, and not this was very vulnerable. I don't, and I think it'd be good for your students to hear this. I put myself in a very vulnerable position here. I'm not real visual on social media, and this song is definitely not in my wheelhouse. Now, saying that, so I'm making myself vulnerable there.
Sure.
But the beauty of that is I've been in that position before. I have the experience of 25 years of playing sessions in this town, and I've played on stuff that wasn't in my wheelhouse before, and had to kind of not fake your way through it, but get through it in a believable way. So I kind of know enough about the style, the way I was hearing it. I was hearing it 2 or 3 different ways. I chose a style that was a little not as straight 2 and 4, that was a little more jumbled up, a little more like Garibaldi meets, not to compare myself with the greatness of Garibaldi, but you see what I'm saying? I kind of went somewhere that's not like my big muscle,
Right.
I could have heard this as a where all the other stuff was doing all the movement and the pushy stuff, and the drums were just real straight, like almost it could have been a 4 on the floor.
So it's funny, because I know you haven't heard the other tracks. Tim and I are the ones that we've heard the other tracks, and we'll give them to everybody kind of once we get down it. But it's been really interesting. Dan and Scott approached it as you just said. They let the other stuff kind of do the heavy lifting and be the busy stuff, picking their moments to come out with that. When I cut it, and I didn't listen to anyone's take. I heard Scott's through my phone real quick, and then I didn't want to listen to anything else, just so I didn't transfer that to my take by accident.
Right.
What's funny is you and I did a similar take of I had heard it the same way. You could do that very Parliament funkadelic, 70s straight ahead. The drummer kind of lays down meat and potatoes while everybody else gets to do their thing. And I took an approach similar to yours where I offset the backbeat. You offset it kind of, what song did it remind me of? James Brown. Hold on.
Oh yeah.
I got the feeling. Yeah, where you delayed that backbeat.
Yeah.
And I actually did an anticipation before the 4. So it was interesting to see 2 of them come in with that thought process and 2 of them come in with the other thought process, but knowing everybody had been, thinking, which way is this supposed to go type of deal.
And another thing that made me kind of take the stance that I did on it was there's not a vocal. If there was a vocal, then that would have changed my mind, Mm-hmm. So I was assuming, because I was hearing the whole track, that this was just an instrumental riff track. So therefore, that says something to me. That said, and because of the busyness of it, it said this doesn't have to be serve the singer and play straight. This you could mix it up a little more than usual and get away with it because of the context. And context is everything. However, in this situation, the context was there was no context, So therefore, I just went with my gut instinct. It's just raw gut instinct, and I took it as an instrumental funk, jam kind of thing, and
that's
again, it's not really my forte,
Right.
More straight stuff and serve the song and be creative within the boundaries. That's kind of more my forte. But anyway, so that's kind of my.
Well, and it's interesting that you should bring up the role of the vocals in you know, kind of dictating what you need to do. So I talk a lot with my students because they see a lot of stuff on social media, and it's a lot of showboating. It's a lot of overplaying, and it's a lot of stepping on other people during the song. To me,
Yeah.
what my ear hears, and so I talk a lot to them about the support role that we play as a rhythm section, and how that can change depending on if the artist wants more. But a lot of times we are kind of the engine that is driving the car. We're not all the flashy stuff on the outside that everybody sees. We're really that thing that's kind of bonding that song together and conveying the message that the song was written about. You know, I try to
Yeah.
always get them to listen, like listen to the lyrics. Do you hear? You hear there's a story there? Okay, well if I do that really cool sextuplet riff for 2 bars around the drums, you know, that covers up everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
No one can hear the story, you know.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you made that distinction. That's really great.
That's kind of why I took the approach I did. So,
Okay.
you know,
Yeah. Now, what I loved was it was also interesting to hear everybody's take on, I call it the breakdown section after that halftime section,
Yeah.
where things kind of get really, really busy.
Yeah.
And I loved your approach to the reverse. I'm a sucker for a good reverse boom chick anytime. And so I loved your approach to laying that down and kind of picking the points that you wanted to branch out on. What made
Well, you know, those accents. That's the point where I felt like, okay, I've done the busy offset thing. I've done, you know, the other sections are kind of, you know, where I did kind of halftime-y, little floaty or halftime kind of thing. I was like, this section needs its own voice, its own moment. And everything just took it up a notch.
Mm-hmm.
So if I take it up, I already thought I was playing too busy anyway. So I was like, I'm not going to play any busier. So I thought, man, what if I anchor it? So I tried, like, you know, 4 on the floor. I was like, well, what if I played quarter notes on the snare? And it was like, man, I think I'm going to go with that. It was just kind of like that kind of works. And it definitely sets that section off to itself, you know. And I just felt like if I would have gotten busier, it would have gotten into mayhem, you know.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that was one of the parts I had considered, funny enough, putting in there, was a reverse boom chick in that part, because, you know, to me it was really chaotic in that section of the music, and I thought, okay, well, something's got to, you know, hold the line, as Toto would talk about.
Yeah.
Like, something's got to toe the line here. So I did a 4 on the floor type of thing, but I had, you know, open hi-hats, and I would accent the upbeat, almost like a pushing, you know, shout section or something.
Yeah.
But it's just funny because that thought had crossed my mind as, you know, a reverse boom chick I think would be an option here. I just never tried it out.
Yeah.
So I love to actually hear. I loved it when you dropped into it, because I was like, I had that same exact thought and almost did it.
Nice. Cool.
So that's very cool. And I love the fill that you play coming out of there. It's simple but really interesting at the same time. The black and
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Yeah, really, really nice touch there.
And, you know, like we talked about, you know, I kind of felt like, to be transparent and honest in this situation, top to bottom.
Right.
No editing, no punching.
Right.
What you hear, what you've got is literally what you see on my video that you sent you is the actual take. Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's it. I videoed it as I did the take. No punches, no nothing. That's not saying, maybe that's a disclaimer. I don't know, but it's just,
and Tim,
I felt that was the honest way to do this, you know?
Yeah. So on the channel, Tim does all the mixing and video editing for me, and we've worked together for about almost 5 years now. He's a great drummer in his own right. We were talking, and he's always telling me, hey man, you know, you don't have to do all of this in one take. You know that we can just edit this stuff together. Because I have one song that I'm working on now, 20 hard fun drum songs. It's 20 songs that are hard. And I had a musician build a mashup of about 15 minutes, and I'm going through playing them. And it's the first one where I finally told him, I said, okay, you're going to get your wish. I'm not recording this whole thing in one take. But everything
Yeah.
else, I would send it to him and he would say, what's taking so long? I said, well, I haven't gotten the take yet. And so mine on the video as well is one take. I gave him, I think, 7 or 8. And I told him, I said, you can cut it if you want and do multiple takes. But he said, no, I wanted to keep it one take.
Yeah, I
So,
gave you guys an extra one for that purpose. I gave
yeah,
I gave really, yeah, I gave you guys an extra one in case I call it spare parts, which is the way I do when I'm working here on songs, and people send me songs and I put drums on it. Usually I'll give them 2 or 3 what I would consider keeper takes. There might be some subtle different things or different drum fills, but most of those are complete performances. And I give them those extras and I tell them, man, it's just spare parts. It's just spare parts. Like if there's a measure that's broken that you don't like, go look at that measure in another take, and you'll probably find, somewhere in that other take what you want or need.
right,
Spare
right.
parts. That's a good thing to think about, because it's so. What's good for one guy is not right for the other guy.
Yeah.
And to give people options, especially when they're not in the room with you. When they're in the room with you and they give you, dude, you're done. That's it. Then I can be done. But when I'm here by myself, no Zooming, no, I'm not, sometimes I do send people, I Zoom with people or I send people my 2 mix and so they can listen to in real time. But most of the time I'm just sitting here, just a guy in a room with his drum set and trying to make magic happen, trying to find that inspiration and go for it. And there's a lot of different ways that bridge could go. What if, especially bridges or, once you kind of find your verse part, once you kind of find your chorus part, minus like little different turns and things, you kind of have it. And then bridges can kind of, you know what I mean? Like bridges are a little more like it could be this or it could be this or it could be this, so I like to give them a couple of options, so they can like plug that in. If they don't like one, they can just use the other.
Right, they can use the other.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. Well, thanks for talking through the song with me. What, I guess, we can leave off with, what is 2 or 3 things, just pieces of advice you would give drummers? Because so many of my students, they're playing in bands, they're playing out. A lot of them are just hobbyists. And so they're coming at this and that they don't have 20 hours a week to devote to the drums. They, maybe have 3 or 4. They really love it. They want to become better at playing songs. What's a couple, 2 or 3 things you could kind of point to, or pieces of advice you could give them for becoming better at playing music and songs?
Absolutely. Number one, listen to a ton of music. Listen. Put headphones on when you're working out. Put headphones on. Put it on when you're driving to work. I know if you don't have 20 hours to sit down behind the kit and practice that week. I am a heavy, heavy believer in listening as practice. It is a method of practice of ingesting, digesting, and man, aren't we all fortunate and lucky to have at our fingertips these days the catalog of music, all music that's ever been made, all the way from the oldest, all styles, all the way up to stuff that I dig, man. I dig on indie stuff, that stuff that I listen to stuff and find stuff that I never would know about if I didn't just dig in there and find this new stuff. And I learn from it. I mean, it gives me, it sparks my imagination. It sparks my creativity. And then when I go into work the next day, I'm kind of inspired. So inspire yourself that way by listening. That's my number one thing. I could stop there and say, don't ever, I mean, physical time behind a drum kit is, of course, obviously necessary, but playing musically, playing not just physically, but emotionally and really dynamically, and learning how to make a song have an arc, a beginning and a middle and an end and everything in between. You can learn a lot of that and how things work by listening and just by just, you know, just that's my biggest piece of advice.
That's a good one, man. That's a good one. Well, I appreciate you taking the time for the call, and you know,
Can I show you my room?
Oh, I would love to see it. Yeah,
Yeah.
your own portable thing. Yeah.
So we're sitting in the control room here, you know,
Okay.
like you've seen it, you know, everybody's got a computer and everybody's got, you know, preamps and stuff. So then what I do, I don't know if you can see, because I have this big window there. And then it goes, my drum room is actually down a flight of stairs from my control room. Here, let me turn the light on. So here's my drum room. I'm standing on the top of, I'm still standing on the floor where the control room is. And then there's the drums I've been working on today. I've got several different configurations that I do depending on the song or whatever. And then there's a booth right there that where I can cut acoustic guitar. So okay. I can cut a whole rhythm section here, you know. I can put a bass player. I usually put the bass player right there in that chair, which he's right there by me. And then I put the guitar player in this chair, and he is actually from that chair, he's like looking right at me. So, and then the keyboard player is up there in the control room, and then right through this door, that's an acoustic booth. So it's not gigantic. I mean, I've got 17-foot ceilings, so I get a good room sound. But it's very good for rhythm sections. Like, it's not like you're not cramped, but you're definitely like breathing the same air. You know what I mean?
Right.
You know, you're definitely you seeing each other's body movements, and I think it creates kind of a unity that's pretty cool. So this kit, this is actually this is the configuration that I used on the song.
Okay.
That kit right there is, do you know who Sam Bacco is? Sam Bacco?
I'm not sure if I do or not.
Sam is the head guy at Craviotto now.
Oh, really? Okay.
And he's the principal of the Nashville Symphony. He's also an incredible drum maker. And so that is like the most simple drum kit ever made. It has no finish on it. It's just Keller shells. It's basically a homemade Gretsch kit, you know?
Okay.
And then
and he made it for you?
Yeah, he made it. And then those toms right there are his too. And they're very Gretschy too. And the kick drum for that's down there. But anyway, that's kind of my setup, you know. Right now I've got a dual snare drum setup, which if you listen closely, I actually utilized on this song, just with a couple of accents with the big fatty over there in the middle of some of those verses on this thing. I used that as a couple of accents. That's about it for the song, but that's basically it. And I control it all just simply from that laptop right there, just with screen sharing, you know.
How long have you been in that space?
I've lived here 20 years.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah. Now, when I first moved here, we weren't even recording in a computer yet.
Right.
Yeah. So I just thought that this room was just going to be my man cave, and my version of a man cave was a room with a bunch of drums in it, and you know, and I was just going to use it as my practice room and jam room and write and things. And then quickly after that, after we moved in here, it just started, you know, digital recording started happening. And man, it was like I lucked out because I was on the front end of
Right.
the whole home studio thing. So I accidentally it was an accident, a happy accident. And so I just started, I've spent my career working with these, world-class engineers in all these great studios around Nashville and having the best preamps and gear, surrounding me that I was spoiled. I was like, if I'm going to do this, it has to be that. It has to be that, So I just started buying the real stuff instead of like buying cheap stuff, I just started like APIs, man. Let's go. Boom. Right. I started buying APIs and Neve and just all, what I thought was, a good color scheme and basically not trendy, but just stand the test of time for just good, solid sounds,
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny you should say, we're finishing up the studio build right now, and my wife is looking forward to getting my drums out of the house because they, have taken over everything. And she said, and I would mention something one night. I said, well, I'll have a kit here set up. And she said, well, no, you have a whole studio now that you're going to, have your stuff at. I said, well, yeah, but I need, a kit at the house to play on. And she said, well, Jackson plays, so you can, that's my 12-year-old. She said, you can use his kit. I said, no, that's not my kit. I said, I got to have a kit. We had this discussion of like, no, that doesn't mean all the drums go away.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes, there's a little misunderstanding here. Right? It's funny, man.
So, well, man, let me just say, you have inspired me over the years. Listening to your recordings and coming up, I used to just gobble up anything that came up about, working musicians, working studio musicians, and you and Dan and Scott were some of the guys that I followed. So I really appreciate you taking part of the project and really appreciate you for what you do and what you have done over the years with your art.
That's
so
nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really, encouraging to me, those words. I appreciate that. I'm humbled and just, again, kind of honored that I would even be on anybody's list to do this. And it was actually really good for me, man. It was a good exercise because it was definitely, like I've mentioned, to you, like definitely out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And I think that's good for all of us, to stretch ourselves, whatever's not your comfort zone, just to be able to step into that and kind of, conquer it and kind of get through it. Even if it's not the strongest version of yourself that you want to show the world. Well, guess what? If you want to be a session player, you're welcome to the world of, what I'm
Better
saying.
learn it. Yeah,
it's not always going to be your favorite groove,
Yeah.
and you got to learn to like really make it believable and put yourself into that as strongly as you would putting yourself into something that's really in your wheelhouse.
Yeah. So, what was, and I got a couple notes on it, but what was, whenever you heard the track and everything, what was your thought process as far as, um, whenever you were coming up with the parts and what you wanted to do?
Well, my first thought was because Scott had kind of introduced me to the whole concept, and one of the selling points he told me, he says, "Oh man, it's easy. It's 2.5 minutes, and it's just a real straight ahead type of thing." And I thought, as I heard the track, I thought, Scott, you are a liar.
Yes.
Because I mean, sure, you could just pick a groove and plow, but particularly there's no vocal on this track, so
Yep.
it's like everything's more exposed. I would approach an instrumental track like this way different than I would if there was a vocal there. You couldn't get away with half of what you do
Yep.
if there's a vocal to consider. So, in a lyric for that matter. But my first approach was to listen down to the whole thing in its entirety and kind of get the lay of the land. Where does it peak? Where does it ebb? Where does it flow? Where am I needed? Where am I not needed? And then I'm thinking about tonally what would work. It
Yeah.
immediately kind of struck me as like a Wolfpack kind of Fearless Flyers kind of vibe. And so
Which
immediately go.
Tim and I were joking about that because the guy that he sent to do the track and write it, those were the two references he gave the guy, was Wolfpack and Fearless Fires. He said, "Did you tell Dan?" I said, "No, I didn't tell him." I said, "I would have told him Fearless Fires." I said, "But I would have never mentioned Wolfpack because I said I don't listen a ton to them." I said, "So that wouldn't have been a name that would have come up and said, 'Hey, Dan, it's in this style.'" But no, that's exactly the style that Tim sent to. To
Yeah,
the guy that
that's.
did it.
I mean, he copped it really, really well. I thought it was great. But those guys generally go for the more retro dark, tight tones, and so
Mhm.
I kind of went that direction with it, choosing. I tuned the toms, really taped down. I taped down the snare. I used a wooden fat. I think it's like a 6.5 birch Yamaha,
Mhm.
and just chose those type of tones, and then kind of worked the arrangement. And I got halfway through the first section. Actually, the first section is I chose to do kind of more of like a light intro before the groove really started, because it seemed like that one lick kind of introduced the pocket of the song, the
Yeah,
little
and
bop bop bop.
that was a interesting thing too, because two people chose to wait until the full band came in with those hits, and two people Steve also chose to come in at the top with it and do something before that.
Yeah.
Um, so it was interesting that, and I love what you did. I felt like it gave it good energy at the front.
Yeah, I always figured, like, a producer always has the option of muting what I did. But they can't put something that's not there.
Yeah.
At any rate, yeah, so after that, I started playing along with it, and you quickly realized that, well, either you commit to being super simple on something like this, or you actually dissect what's going on. And I could not just naturally pick up. There's no real straight ahead phrasing. And
Yeah.
so I went ahead and, made the notes.
Got the chart.
Particularly, I kind of just transcribed rhythmically what the bass player was doing, because that to me was kind of where I would live, trying to
Mhm.
lock the bass drum, or not necessarily locking to everything he's doing, but paying respect to and knowing
Yeah.
what's there. That
Yeah.
kind of shaped what I was doing. So
It was an interesting thing to look at as well, the use of the hi-hat as well as the snare. So Scott and you did a 2 and 4 type of a backbeat, and your treatment of the hi-hat though was for my ear a little bit differently. So his was a more even hi-hat that drove a little harder from that top end, similar to, I mentioned to him, like Parliament's Flashlight or Rick James' Super Freak or something like that,
right,
where it's got that pretty prominent hi-hat driving.
sure.
And yours, for me, had a little bit more of a heavier tilt to the downbeat. And the song, was it the Mnemonics that did Got to Give, was it Got to Give Love One More Try, something, that old funk thing, or the
Oh,
Gap
yeah, yeah,
Band early in
yeah,
the morning. And then
right.
I actually did an upbeat treatment to that.
Really
It reminded
cool.
me of a more of a New Orleans upbeat. There were a lot of upbeat hits to it. And then Steve did a more of a broken hi-hat. So it was really a
Really, I
interesting.
can't wait to hear all this. That's so cool.
And then, you and Scott did a 2 and 4 backbeat. Steve went more of what was the one I gave to him? James Brown, I Got the Feeling, where it delays that onto the upbeat, I believe it is. He delays that too. And
where was he laying the backbeat in that section?
I think he laid instead of on 2, I think he put it on the upbeat. I think he delayed it there. And then I actually did the downbeat of 2, but then I hit the 3, of 3 instead of the downbeat of 4, because there was a lot of
Right.
of 3 happening.
Right.
Or E of 3, I forget. I have to go back and listen.
Absolutely.
But it was interesting. 2 chose to do one way choose, and then 4 different takes on the hi-hat as far as that section. So it was really interesting.
I think it's all informed by our influences and what we grew up listening to, and positive.
So what did you grow up listening to? What?
Well, you know, I grew up listening to a lot of stuff, but formatively, when I first moved to town, I was working a lot with a guy named Tommy Sims, and we would do a lot kind of in this vibe, and I would build parts off how the feedback from him and the other players were in it, and I kind of developed a thing that worked for that situation. So with that, what you're identifying in the hat is kind of where I landed after kind of those influences and developing tracks like that. I don't know. There's something about the hat that can be annoying and unuseful, particularly when you go to mixing and paying heed to other instruments sonically, you know? So that's one thing I've kind of grown to learn, especially now that we're all tracking our own drums and we're all mixing our own stuff. It's like you kind of have to pay attention to sonics now, and sometimes I'll overcompensate for the fact that, you know, trashy hi-hats, it's fun to play, but they're horrible to mix, and it does horrible sonic things to the rest of the drum kit. So sometimes I'll overcompensate and really lighten up the velocity of my hats comparatively to other things, just so the other things speak better.
Right.
You know, I don't know. It's habits and things it's interesting the paths that we've taken. So.
Well, you know, and when I was in New Orleans, because I lived there for a few years playing Bourbon Street, and I took a deep dive into the funk because I was playing with a horn band. We were a dance club. Yeah. So I took a deep dive in that funk, and it's funny because you can come up with instances of how everyone treated everything. There's instances of it in the funk genre of like, well, that works because here's an example of that. As well as what you were talking about, you know, really locking in and letting other things do the heavy lifting. I mentioned Parliament earlier. When you've got somebody like, what was it, Bootsy? With them. Yeah. When you've got a Bootsy, you really have a choice to make there of, am I going to latch onto that like a Tower Power, or am I just going to do what they did in Parliament, and that's lay down the law of where it is.
And you don't know what causes, you know, as you get older, and as I've gotten older and gone to research and listened to things of why they played things the way they did. Like, you know, I always think of this example. I was watching a show they were featuring Ringo and all his parts that he came up for these Beatles tracks. And there's what's the name of something? That groove. And I've always listened to that groove and it's like, wow, that is so genius. The way he's not playing it like on their good. He's got kind of a lilt to it. And he lays back that second stroke and he's like, oh, actually, man, it's like I'm left-handed. I couldn't reach over there, and I didn't mean to play it like that, but that's kind of how it ended up playing. I'm like, oh crap! That's like I'm thinking it was genius, but it was like kind of like just because the way he played, you know.
Yeah.
So it's things like that. I think shape. It's interesting because a lot of drummers would have been influenced by that and shaped the way they played based on something that he had no control over. You know what I mean? Yeah. And it becomes the hip thing, you know. Another one of those things where the Coldplay was, you know, they came out with that one record with clocks on it, and you would be hard pressed to find a drum fill on that record if you listen to it. It's all great, cool idea pockets, different, you know, but not a lot of drum fills on that record, if any. If you find one, let me know. At any rate, but so that informed the music of the day. So when we would do sessions around the time that came out, if you did drum fills, people would be like, come on, dude, make it more like Coldplay. Don't play any no drum fills, man. It's not cool, you know. I'm like, oh, yeah, you know. I would love to go ask him, like, why did you put any drum fills? You're making my life difficult, you know.
Yeah, and it's funny, you know, that drummer. He was originally, I think the
guitarist, right?
Was it guitar, or piano? One of the two. It wasn't a drum. Wasn't
he wasn't a drummer, right? Yeah.
And I always point to him as a good example of listen to his parts and listen to how they latch into the melody and everything else going around, because he very much leads with that. It's interesting. Another thing that was really fun to look at was everybody's treatment of the, I guess you could call it the bridge section,
Yeah.
that gets a lot busier with everything happening, and everybody chose in their own way to drive through that, no matter what they had done with the rest of the song. It was Steve that did a reverse boom chick that he felt drove through that, and then picked a couple of the hits, almost like a big band shout section, where there's a couple things you're going to hit, but the rest of it, we'll just let you guys do those lines because it's so busy.
Yeah.
It was cool to see how everyone actually made that same choice instead of getting busier. Everybody pulled back.
Yeah, that part, I remember that section. I was channeling Steve Gadd for sure on that. That's a Steve Gadd groove that I was using, and then just kind of accenting some of the stuff with it. It's like you kind of have to pick your battles on stuff like that. You can choose to be, because I've been on sessions where I get criticized for being too literal on stuff like that and trying to get everybody's hit or kick, and then criticized for not getting anybody's hit. So it's like, oftentimes you can have to feel out the client that you're working for. In this case, there's no talking, just do your work, and so I try to pick the middle ground, pick your battles. These are important hits. I think these are the most important. Let's get these. Otherwise, let's kind of lock the thing down for everybody else to ride over,
Yeah, I really loved what you did in the halftime section. That was one of the things that whenever I listened to everybody's after, that was one of the sections where I was like, well, hold on, maybe just throw that track away and I'll recut, because what he did there was really, it was really hip. Like, I really like that. So what made you, the kick drum really does drive that section well, still in halftime, but it's not a part that I would have thought to write for that. I thought it was a very...
That idea kind of spawned from, I used to play in a lot of gospel records, and I kind of built that. I remember working with Israel Houghton. That was a groove that he would latch on to. It seemed to work well in his tracks. It's just one of those pockets where it keeps everything driving, but it still leaves space in the mid to high range areas for other things to happen,
Yeah.
Picaro did that a lot too. He would like drive things in halftime,
Yep.
And it's just an effective.
Yeah, I thought it just drove it real well. It's funny you should mention gospel, because that was, whenever it got to the bridge section we were just talking about, that was more of, I grew up, my dad preached in a lot of black churches, and he actually started 2 black churches, one of the whitest guys you'll ever meet, but
awesome.
it was fun to kind of grow up with that. And that bridge section reminded me, I opened the hats and was acting the upbeats and drove with the kick drum, just drove through it. Kind of a shout section within a gospel tune. It's funny that, kind of reference that, but I really love what you did with that halftime section. Really
thank you, man.
Different
Appreciate
and drove it. Okay, so the big one and would be the space at the end, which everybody chose to fill up just because it was begging to have it filled up. I loved your placement of it though, because you added some space in there as well in between what you were doing.
Yeah, I kind of have a philosophy sometimes on tracks. Like I said before, pick your battles, and oftentimes. I think a great example of what I'm talking about is Picaro. Generally, he would always pick like one spot in a song to kind of, all right, I'm here, but otherwise it was like just, doing your job. And I really hadn't done a lot in the rest of that track. So I thought, well, here's a hole that could probably use a little bit of decoration. And, but because of the Gadd-esque before, particularly in that bridge section, I thought, well, what if we approached it from, because honestly, I tried a bunch of different things in there. I'm like, well, maybe this or maybe this or maybe that. But the kind of the Gadd approach where there's holes and there's spaces and but it's a constant rhythmic theme. There's some sort of a motif going on there.
Yeah.
But it's kind of over the bar line. I thought that would have been fun. So it seemed to work out okay.
Yeah, I loved it, man. I loved it.
Thanks.
I guess, one more question for you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, we have a lot of students that they're hobbyists at the drums, and it's not something they're going to do for a living. We have some that are students that are going to want to do it for a living. We have some that are teachers, and so they're kind of run the gamut. And some of them don't have 20 hours a week for the drums. They have 3 or 4 hours a week, but they started drumming so that they could play music better. And so I'm asking everybody to give 2 or 3 of your tips for how would you encourage a person, a player, to become better at playing music instead of just the drums.
Oh, that's an interesting way of posing that, because I think there's an underlying presupposition in that statement. You know what I mean? Because you're saying, well, let's not focus so much on learning the drums as learning how to play music, and there's a big separation there. I think that's kind of what you're insinuating. And I think the trend now tends to be to let's learn this instrument, the instrument of drums, and like learn how to do all the crazy fills and time signatures and that's really fun, absolutely. But that probably won't get you a lot of work, and it doesn't make the other players in the band enjoy your playing very much. I think it's just to help. A good tip I would say is to refocus on what the purpose of playing drums is, and that's to enhance the song, enhance backing up like a vocalist, and making sure that everything you're doing is to make them look good. Putting the focus on the song, putting the focus on the artist, and approach your drum parts from the mindset of, if I'm doing this, is it drawing attention away from what the more important element of the song is? Maybe the lyric, maybe the melody. Of course, there's always times to shine, but I think, viewing music through that filter of wanting to, I don't know how to say exalt because that sounds too spiritual, but to enhance somebody else other than, a lot of guys I've noticed in the past few years, oftentimes when I see them playing, it's almost like they're playing like they're auditioning to get the part. Like they're overdoing it, and it's more about look at what I'm doing, look what I'm doing, look how I'm expressing myself. And I mean, I guess there's a place for that, but based on my experience through life, it's like I think it's also kind of a biblical principle when you focus on, and it's good business too, when you focus on making other people look good, people are always going to come back to you and ask you for your services again.
Yep. It's a tip I used to give to my wife whenever we first got married, because growing up, my dad was a pastor. I was always in rooms with lots of people and having to talk to them. And we were going to a party, and she said, I never know what to say at these parties. And I said, oh, well, here's what you do. You just have 2 or 3 questions that you can ask every person. And it can be the same question, just wash, rinse, repeat with the next person. I said, usually you don't get through the first. I said, because everybody likes talking about themselves. And if you're that person, it is. I said, and if you're the person at the party, and think about the last person that you really loved, it was that person that sat there and let you talk about yourself. I said, so just sit there and let them do the talk, and you just when they get done, just have your second question. I said,
psychology, man, that's so good. That's really good.
It's very much the same thing with the music. So, well, thank you, man. I sure do appreciate you doing this. And
it was an absolute blast. I can't wait to hear all the guys, and we're all friends, so I'll call them up and rib them.
Well, I told the other guys too, just a big thank you to you. Coming up, I really idolized different session players, and I watched all of you guys as I came up. And what you were doing and the moves you were making and how you carried yourself in your career. And I just really appreciate you taking the time for students and to kind of inform the next generation that's coming up, and let them know what making real music is really about, and kind of what you have to think about. So
I really appreciate what you're doing, man, because this is, I know it seems like there's a lot on the market right now, but what you're doing specifically, I think is really needed, and it's a wonderful service you're providing. So thank you.
Yeah, man. This one is my take and why I did what I did within this song. One of the things that I haven't really talked a lot about is coming up. You go through different phases, and I was into punk rock coming up and played in a lot of rock bands, but I also played a lot of stage shows. And so a couple of different directions I could see my career going. I really was interested in actually drumming on Broadway. I found that to be, I liked stage shows. I liked being in theater. I liked responding to the cue. I liked every night going and having to deliver an original performance with the same material. Another area that I really, really was into was the job of a studio drummer. So guys like Paul Lime or Leem, however you will pronounce that. And then the guys that are in this, Scott Williamson, Dan Needham, Steve Brewster, all of these guys are guys that I looked up to because I was really looking at doing, having that be my career. Whenever I got to Nashville, the studio work had changed, and growing up to be just a studio drummer is very rare these days because that whole world has changed with the advent of home recording studios and all these things. All of these guys that are in this series have a home recording studio. Well, listen, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that was unheard of. The equipment, the price to get in was too high, as well as the job that I do. It was unheard of. The price was too high to have a video recording studio in your home, and that's really what I have. And so once I kind of got here, I was listening to the session players that have been doing it like so long they were getting retirement from the musicians union, and I was listening to them talk, and they were saying, I'm going to get it back on the road because there's not as much session work as there used to be. The road guys wanted to come home because they missed their family and all their friends and didn't want to travel so much. I just kind of started looking at things, and that's whenever I took a step back and said, I think I need to reassess and really take a hard, realistic look at where the music industry is right now and what's my part in it. And so I did that. And so now I have a completely different career where I teach drums to drummers all around the world. And I love it. I love it. But this project was really fun for me because it kind of gave me the opportunity to jump back into the driver's seat of a career that growing up looked different than it does now, and one that I actually really aspired to. So it really was kind of a different head game for me to think through that my recording was going to be up against guys like Scott Williamson, Dan Needham, and Steve Brewster, not in a who is better competition. I was actually, honestly, the thing that had me more concerned was the sounds I was going to be able to capture, because the mics I'm using right now would not be what I would use in that type of a situation as well. The room I'm in is not treated for that. I'm set up for teaching online. I'm not set up for tracking, albums, that type of thing. And you might be like, Steven, that's not really it really is a different type of a setup. And so I was actually very, very nervous about the sounds I was going to capture. So anyway, it was a ton of head games that I had to go through recording this, but it was a lot of fun for me to get to play the role of studio drummer for a day and kind of revisit something that I really used to spend a lot of time studying and being into. And whenever I moved to Nashville, I actually began getting into the studio scene a good bit, doing sessions and anyway, this was just a fun project for me to get to go back through. So I appreciate you following along with this series. This is the fourth part of that series, and this is going to be me playing my version of the exact same song the other three played. I did not listen to their takes before I recorded mine on purpose because I didn't want to be influenced by that. A lot of people have asked me that. And so I hope you enjoy it. It's my take on this song. And then there will be a small section where I talk about why I did what I did. All right, so now we are going to talk about why I played what I played. It's a little bit odd because I was kind of interviewing the other guys and had talking points, and I've been thinking about recording this, and I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to say about my own playing. I don't know. I mean, I just did that thing. It's different when you have someone giving you prompts and cues, but we'll just kind of walk through my thought process. So with a song like this, at the beginning of it, there really is, and with any song, there's two choices. You can either come in or you don't come in at the top. But with this one in particular, because there's no bass up at the top, you really have that choice of, am I going to come in or am I going to save that entrance for later whenever the bass enters and have it be a full band entrance? And when I was recording this, I thought if I was doing this live, I would probably come in to keep the energy going. But in this session, I think I'm going to wait and come in with the bass. And so that's what I did. Now in that A section, we'll call it the A section, there's in my mind, again, two schools of thought for this. You can completely drive through, because it's a very busy bass pattern. If you see this written down, if you're a student in my online drum school, you have access to all these transcriptions of all the drummers, the chart, the download of the drumless track, all that stuff. You can find that at stevensdrumshed.com. For me, very busy bass pattern. You kind of have a couple different ways that you can look at this. And you may have heard me mention this in the other interviews. And so the thought process of going through was, do I want to really drive it home, either 4 on the floor or a 1 and 3 on the kick drum, a la a Parliament, because they have obviously a very famous bass player, Bootsy Collins, and you have a choice to make with a bass player like that. You can either choose to do what like a David Garibaldi would do and really interlace his parts very tightly with what's happening with the bass player, or you can choose to really lay down the meat and potatoes pocket and let the bass be the, if you're considering this a Christmas tree, let that be the, the ornaments on the Christmas tree. And you're just doing what they would call in the studio, you're doing the heavy lifting for the song. So in other words, you're getting it to the finish line, pushing it forward, driving the train, and allowing the bass and the other guitar and the other instruments to do the shining. You're kind of taking a backseat to that, driving that train. So that was one school of thought. The other school of thought for me was, you have, if you study funk, Zorro actually has a fantastic the history of funk drumming, funk and R&B drumming. It's an old DVD that I watched when I was in New Orleans playing that type of music. It was very, very informative for me, talking all about the role of the hi-hat and the snare drum, bass drum, that kind of a thing. And I recommend to everyone going and listening and watching that if you can find it. But for me, this almost was reminded me of some James Brown, reminded me, you could take that, Garibaldi Tower of Power, much more syncopated version of funk. You've got James Brown with that displaced backbeat, kind of what his Clyde Stubblefield and J-Bo Starks became known for, was that displaced backbeat. And that was kind of what I was feeling. I was like, I kind of want to vary this up a little bit. And the first part I came up with, obviously, because I'm a drummer and everyone as drummers will admit that the first part you usually come up with is way more complicated than anything that actually needs to be on the song. And so then it came to the editing phase where I really had to listen to things and go, and there's still 1 or 2 places in the song where I feel like if I played it again, I might take a couple things out. I find myself taking things out of music more than trying to add two things. For me anyway, the older I get, the more experienced I get. And so that was my thought process with the snare drum, and to kind of hook on to some of the lines that were happening to accent those with the snare drum. With the hi-hat, I have this upbeat accent because a lot of the hits to me were driving to that upbeat. And so for me, that was where I wanted to go with that. So for that A section, I guess, again, it's kind of hard for me to go through this myself because it's like, okay, remember back there, Stephen, I don't have anybody prompting me. So that was for the A section, my thought process. And then you have the halftime section. where I kept the upbeat happening on the right cymbal bell, and then I also kept that on the hi-hat, so with my foot. And to me, that just kept a consistency. I needed that consistency throughout the song. I kind of wanted that to be a string, if you will, that the listener could follow throughout the song. So even though it's in halftime, you still have that upbeat happening that's familiar to the ear. In the next section, I would, you may have heard me refer to it almost like a gospel shout section or a big band shout section. I don't know if that's even a term for gospel song. It's it's what I refer to it. Growing up, my father actually preached in a lot of Black churches. And so I had the privilege of experiencing in person that music and the vibe and all that stuff. So anyway, to my ear, that would be more of like this pushing shout section. And I just really wanted to drive that section. I wanted everything else to kind of do the work. And again, open hi-hat and accenting the upbeats. I felt like that still needed to be there. And that was, turns out a little bit different than what everybody else did. Now, the last halftime part, and you heard, I think it was Dan, although his treatment of the first section of halftime was just so beautiful. Oh man, I heard it and I thought, God, I don't even want to hear my version anymore. It was so great. That second halftime section, it can almost go to a full time, and that's what you heard Dan take it to. And I think Scott was the one, if I'm remembering correctly, that also talked about it could have been a full time. And so the thought process for me, the same as with Steve Brewster, and I mentioned it in the interview with him, I also thought what I would call a reverse boom chick, right? So back, goom, back, instead of goom, back, kind of that punk rock beat. He reversed that on that bridge section. I had thought about that. That was an option I was throwing around. It was funny to hear several of the options I had thought about that they actually did. And I heard them kind of echo the same things. But for the second halftime section, I thought about taking it full time, but instead I kept it halftime. Paid a little bit more attention to some of the lines that were happening. So a little bit busier, but not more for the fact of being busy, but more for sometimes I don't really view things in notes. I view things in I had a saxophone player tell me in college. I said, he was a beautiful player, won all these awards. And I said, when you're playing a solo, what are you thinking about? And he said, I'm really thinking about shapes and I'm thinking about colors. And of course, I was just not experienced enough. And I'm like, okay, weirdo, I'll think about shapes and colors, and I went away from that thinking that gave me nothing. And now years later, that gives me so much because now I don't really think in terms of how busy the notes are. I think of intensity. It's like how intense I can make that moment. If that requires more notes, then that's so be it. So that was kind of my thought for that, even though there's nothing like Vinnie Colaiuta happening in there. I just felt like bring a little bit more intensity to that section to end the song. And then the ending, I wanted to accent what was happening there as well as fill some of those holes that were happening. So anyway, that's kind of my thought process for going through this whole thing. There's two schools of thought. Again, we can drive through it and really drive the train, do the heavy lifting that way, or we can really interlace with the different parts. And there is an overboard with that. There is accenting too much that's going on. Like it doesn't all need to be accented that much, And so I finished it and laid the track down, and then I really thought, I don't know, maybe I accented too much of it. Maybe I should have pulled back. But I think that's really what we all wind up dealing with, or that thought process going through, considering. I think that's a process that we all go through. It's also harder whenever there's not the collaborative process of everyone coming into the studio together. Because really, with a studio session, you'll have musicians coming in and they're feeding off of each other. And so one thing as a drummer that I always love to do, and if you're in a session, it's always a good way to know if you have a solid take. And so you do listen backs. You do your takes and then you come in and you listen back. Everybody listens back. And I liked to always sit in the back of the room as far back as I could get so I could see everyone. And I would just watch them as we listened. And I learned to watch people when I was in New Orleans playing at a dance club. I almost lost my gig because I couldn't make people dance. And if you play at a dance club and you can't make people dance, it's kind of the opposite of a dance club. It's a stand club, and they fire you. And so I learned to watch certain people that came in the club, specifically Black people, because I found that if I could make them dance and bob their head, I was on to something, right? And so I would in studio sessions, I would stand back and I would listen and watch and make sure I would see what their reactions were, see how were they bobbing their head, were they tapping their foot, were they kind of making a quizzical look, all of those things. And I could almost tell you without listening. I could just mute the whole soundtrack and just watch them. And I could tell you if we had a take that was good. So without having all that feedback, you do the take and you're like, okay, well, I think that's good. And all the drummers that were involved with this, we all, once we listened to the others, we're like, oh man, that part's so great that you played there. Oh man, I wish I would have, there's always that. And so for me, this was just a really enjoyable project to be a part of, to be able to work on a project with Steve and Scott and Dan, and to hear their takes on the songs. It was just a real privilege. And I would encourage you to go seek out recordings that they are on. If you ever get a chance to have a lesson with one of them or anything like that, that well worth the time, even just to sit down and have a conversation with them, because they're just a wealth of knowledge, and they are all very humble men. And I do believe that's why they work as much as they do. I've met several people in the industry that are not humble, and they have a very different approach. And I think that leads to a shorter career, if we're just speaking honestly here. I find that humility and really trying to serve the music will take you a very long way. And humility is not an easy thing, because it often requires kind of getting punched in the mouth and then being able to go back home and lick your wounds and figure out why that happened and learn from it. And once you've learned from it, go back and do better, and never put yourself on a pedestal above others, that you've achieved something that is special or anything like that. Really just doing the next best thing you can for the music and for other people. And these guys all exemplified that. And throughout the process, they all just wanted it to be as good as possible. And I will give it to them for their credit. Look, I have been in the music business and have been doing this professionally since the age of 15, 16, playing gigs, but I took a very different route. I was doing some touring, I was doing some studio sessions, and then I said, you know what, this is not the route that I need to do that's going to be the direction I want my career to go in as far as longevity. And so I had to turn the ship. And so coming back into the, if you will, legit musical world of gigging drummers that tour and studio session players. And oftentimes if not a lot of people take you serious when you say, hey, I have this idea for a YouTube video. And so to these guys' credit, they really trusted me, trusted Tim Buell, who worked on this with me. And I think the end result came out great. If you haven't seen the video yet, go check that out. You can find it on the YouTube channel. If you're needing some help with your drumming, please jump over to stevensdrumshed.com. I've got an online drum school there. You can find all of the resources from this project there. And I would love to help you take your drumming to the next level. I will see you, I guess not really see you. You will hear me in the next episode here on The Drum Show.